Welcome to the Syria Spectrum, bringing you policy through perspectives. I'm your host, Zakaria Al Shmaly. Today's episode is about the Syrian-Israeli relations, not a comprehensive historical study, but a policy-based analysis of the current relationship, dynamics, and future developments. The relationship has always been asymmetric. Syria often treated Israel as a central strategic adversary that shaped its security and politics. Israel, for long stitches, treated Syria as a secondary file. However, post-Assad map made the Syria file impossible to ignore. To see how that asymmetry formed, one must start in 1948. The war and its aftermath, the Nakba, shaped Syria's early civil-military balance, and the region quickly became an arms and allegiance marketplace. Of course, with the Palestinian question. In the late 1940s until the mid-1950s, Syria's military procurement was constrained by an American-led Western boycott of arms sale, which pushed Damascus in the 1950s to diversify towards the Eastern Bloc channels, and even though parts of the political elites remained Western-educated and anti-communist. This military relationship had a major political ramification. In 1949, Syria and Israel signed their first general armistice agreement, including a demilitarized zone, with the DMZ being more or less the same as the UN-recognized borders. However, the armistice did not deter skirmishes nor the 1967 war. Fast forward, by 1974, after the wars of 1967 and 73, Syria and Israel entered the long era of what we might call no-peace managed frontier, built around separation lines, limitation zones, and the UN's monitoring presence. Nevertheless, the conflict continued through proxies in the region, albeit on a less intensive scale. This managed frontier architecture matters today because negotiations keep reaching for it as a template. During the revolution, the relationship between the Assad regime and Israel was one of containment, and the power vacuum and chaos allowed Israel to intensify its intelligence gathering and operations inside of Syria. Then comes the unexpected. Assad falls on December 8, 2024. Israel moves forces into the UN-monitored separation area and conducts over 600 airstrikes on Syrian military locations with what it called Operation Arrow of Bashan. The UN called to a return to the 1974 framework, but the relationship was more complex than that. Regional powers such as Saudi Arabia and Turkey started sponsoring talks. Even the US began backing mediations. In fact, by July 2025, Reuters reported on US mediations contacts in Paris even before the negotiations in January 2026. By mid-July 2025, multiple outlets have also reported on Syrian-Israeli contacts in Baku, in a broader environment where Azerbaijan is positioning itself as a conveying space for regional deconfliction. And in January 2026, talks in Paris produced the most concrete public outcome so far: a US-supervised communication mechanism to coordinate on intelligence sharing, military de-escalation, diplomatic engagement, and even commercial opportunities. But the heart of the file is still unresolved. Syrian officials make it explicit: no progress on strategic files without binding, clear timeline for Israeli troop withdrawal from territory seized after Assad's fall means no deal. So today, our episode is about Syrian-Israeli relations, and it's organized around these four questions. Number one, what is actually being negotiated? Number two, what are the interests and leverages each side has? Number three, what are the red lines? What are the floors, ceilings of a possible deal? And finally, what could spoil it? Our guest is Elizabeth Tsurkov. She's a senior non-resident fellow at the New Lines Institute for Strategy and a policy and PhD candidate at Princeton University Politics Department. Elizabeth recently discussed the podcast with Amberin Zaman on why US pressure could push Israel towards a security deal with Syria's new government. And we're going to build on that by mapping the negotiations or term sheets for what could be realistic in the next steps in this relationship. Elizabeth, welcome and good morning.
Thank you. Good morning.
In early January, there was US-mediated talks in Paris, and the public outcomes was a dedicated communication mechanism, a fusion or a coordinated channel. Some people are joking, they're just calling it a WhatsApp group managed by an American. So how would you characterize this new fusion or this new communication mechanism? What do you think are some misconceptions on the Syrian and on the Israeli general public that might have?
Well, it's not supposed to be a WhatsApp group. It's supposed to be an actual physical location in Amman, Jordan, where there would be presence of an Israeli, a Syrian representative, and U.S. representative. The problem is this is still being set up. And what Special Envoy Barak announced after the talks in Paris that we expect Israel to kind of halt its operations in Syria until this fusion cell is established, and therefore coordination channels can open up. But Israel has not paused its activities. Since the massacre in Beijing, which Israeli soldiers entered the town of Beijing to arrest two people wanted. According to Israel, they are affiliated with Jama'a Islamiyya, which is a, kind of a branch of Hamas. They entered. They entered the town. Locals opened fire on them, and Israeli soldiers were injured. But also Israeli soldiers opened fire. There were also airstrikes, and at the end of the day, basically 13 Syrians were killed, including women and children. So after that, no shootouts have occurred, and no Syrians have been killed, but Israel continues to raid villages, continues to arrest people, continues to conduct patrols, continues to stop people at checkpoints, and basically arrest them and take them into Israel, where they are usually questioned briefly and then released, but then some people are then moved to prisons. And according to testimonies collected by Syrian human rights activists, those Syrians have been placed in Sde Tayman and Ofer prisons that are used to hold Palestinian militants, where conditions are extremely, extremely poor, particularly since October 7th, when there's this, a systematic and policy of basically making the lives of prisoners miserable. This was previously justified during the time when there were hostages held in Gaza, is that you will be held in the conditions that hostages in Gaza are being held. So they're being tortured and starved, you'll be tortured and starved. Now, all the hostages are out, and this policy continues. So this is what Syrians are being subjected to in Israeli prisons.
Thank you very much. But I think this is raising way more questions for me when we're talking about these negotiations. The fact that there are Syrian citizens in Israeli prisons without representation or anything. So do we know what's currently being discussed in the negotiations? Because we're hearing all of this noise, all of these different things, like some things about withdrawal lines, demilitarization, hostage exchange. What do we know?
So, actually, the issue of the prisoners who've been taken into Israel, Syrians, I'm not aware that this was discussed. This does not mean that it wasn't. But what is being discussed is the matter of gradual Israeli withdrawal from the areas it newly occupied after the fall of the Assad regime. The most contentious point appears to be Jabal al-Sheikh, because that area indeed has some military usefulness, because it overlooks basically much of Syria, but also very importantly for Israel, the border into Lebanon, and basically smuggling routes of weapons to Lebanese Hezbollah. So that has been a contentious point. What is being discussed at the same time is the issue of demilitarization. And while the Syrian negotiators have accepted the idea in principle, the extent of forces that Israel is demanding, or at least was demanding at late last year, the extent of forces that the Syrian government would be allowed to deploy in the south was so minimal that Syrian negotiators were fearful that this is something that will not allow them to just maintain security and prevent the emergence of militias that would operate there and could endanger stability of the region, or just even this like stability of southern Syria, but also the stability of Syria as a whole. Um, and there have been media reports about kind of additional elements to this deal that would include some kind of economic cooperation, trade, but this is something that hasn't been really there is not a whole deal of information about it. And then negotiations, from my information of people who are informed of the talks, the focus is mostly on the issue of withdrawal in exchange for demilitarization, and the withdrawal would be gradual. And the gradual withdrawal, part of it stems from kind of the idea of building trust that Israel kind of wants to see. If the areas from which it withdraws do not serve as location from which attacks could in theory be planned or carried out against Israel. But also, I think a major factor here is domestic politics in Israel, and we can go into that, I hope, later in the episode.
For sure. We're going to go into domestic politics both in Syria and Israel about this, because I think the populations have not had any kind of engagement or haven't heard anything about each other for quite some time. So it would be quite interesting about how the negotiators and how these governments that in my eyes are temporary, both, and how are they selling it to the people, knowing that they might come to elections later. For now, I just want to ask you, from these points that we've been discussing, are there any principles or areas that everyone agrees on and some that are more stuck? Because you've mentioned Jabal al-Sheikh. I imagine, yes, this is clearly rightly stuck, I would understand. Are there any areas that everybody agrees on from both sides that you can take as a starting point and build on?
Well, the issue is that there's a problem on the Israeli side. There is somewhat of a disconnect between the working level and even senior people who were leading the negotiations. So previously this was Tzachi Hanegbi, the head of the Israeli National Security Council, and then it was Minister Ron Dermer, who is very close to Netanyahu, but he retired. He got tired of he was kind of running all the heavy files, normalization with Saudi Arabia, Gaza, and also Syria. And he faced a great deal of opposition internally in Israel because the negotiations, since he assumed control of the negotiations for the release of hostages in Gaza, there were progress stalled essentially because the Israeli government, Netanyahu, wanted to prolong the war. So he was very much maligned by protesters, by families of the hostages, and he just got tired of people protesting in front of his house all the time and decided to quit. And he's now working. It was reported that he now works for Jared Kushner, so he's in a private sector basically. So both of them, both Hanegbi and Dermer, were supportive of reaching an agreement with Damascus. While the Israeli Minister of Defense, who doesn't really understand much about defense, he was brought into the ministry basically because he's kind of a puppet of Netanyahu, and he would obey basically Netanyahu's demand to cooperate with a law that would essentially provide loopholes for ultra-Orthodox men to avoid serving in the military. The previous Minister of Defense opposed this, so therefore he was fired and replaced by Katz. So Katz opposes a deal. He sees the new Syrian leadership as jihadist, and it's impossible to do a deal with it. You cannot trust them, etc. And Netanyahu, it seems to me, is from the way he has conducted himself in these negotiations, is not interested in a deal. He understands that it would be politically costly for him domestically, and this is why things that, for example, there was an issue that was debated last year during the negotiations. Was this issue? This is something that Israel raised this demand after the massacre of the Druze in Sweden in July. That it wants a safe passage from the occupied Golan to Sweden to be able to provide supplies, to be able, in theory, to provide weapons to the militias that are operating there. And this is a demand that people in Sweden genuinely want. Like, I'm in touch with people in Sweden; they genuinely want this. And the Special Envoy Barak, the U.S. rejected this demand by Israel. And it seems that Israel gave up on it. Then there was renewed pressure on Israel to advance towards a deal around September of last year, when there was the UN General Assembly meeting, and Trump was there, and Netanyahu was there, and Ashara was there, and the idea was to announce the deal then. And there was pressure on Israel to advance towards it and reach an agreement. And then Israel suddenly re-added this demand of of this safe crossing, which basically led to the talks not progressing anywhere. Then Israel upped the ante, and in public rhetoric, this was in August and later on, Israeli officials, including the Israeli Minister of Defense, stated explicitly Israel will never withdraw from the areas it newly occupied in Syria until a full normalization deal. So basically, you will essentially get the bits that Israel occupied after the fall of the Assad regime, and in exchange, basically, there's full peace, and Israel gets to keep the Golan, obviously. And this is obviously an unacceptable position for the Syrians. So the issue is that without sustained U.S. pressure, basically, Israel will continue to hold maximalist positions because there's no political interest in reaching this agreement. But once U.S. pressure is applied, as it was applied after the massacre in Beijing, after that, basically, the Israel suddenly, the rhetoric completely changed from Israeli officials, and they started suddenly only speaking about a demilitarized zone in the south. Not Israel will remain there until a full normalization deal is reached. So I believe that if there was sustained U.S. pressure on Israel and on Syria, some issues, to reach a deal, this could be reached relatively quickly. The issue is that the U.S. is busy with many other files. Now there's Iran, Ukraine, Venezuela, and domestic issues that it just distracts U.S. attention.
China,
and then basically this allows kind of Israel to just maintain the status quo, which is preferable to the Israeli leadership compared to a deal, which would entail restricting Israel's freedom of action in Syria. And for those who are listening, I'm putting this in air quotations. This is basically a freedom that Israel is now that Israeli officials have made up. Like there's freedom of speech and there's freedom of assembly. Israeli officials have made freedom of action, חופש פעולה, which means basically we want to be able to, Israel wants to be able to strike in Syria and act militarily whenever it wishes, and the Syrian government should not oppose it. Now, I understand if it's an imminent threat, any country would do such a thing, right? But in the case when you have a security deal with the Syrian government and it can address the threat, it can go and it can arrest people, for example, who are wanted by Israel. And the Syrian government, I know this from my own information, has expressed the willingness to do that. They themselves don't want these rogue groups, whatever, affiliated with Hamas, affiliated with Iran, to be acting in Syria and destabilizing. Their first target is the new Syrian regime. Hezbollah rockets were caught in Gaza recently. They were aimed at Damascus. They were not aimed at at the occupied Golan or at Israel. So they themselves have an interest in dealing with this. But the problem is that for domestically in Israel for the freedom of action, this new freedom. The freedom of action will be restricted. Israel will have to withdraw from areas that are occupied, even if gradually. This is something that is politically costly domestically in Israel, especially because of the way the new Syrian leadership is viewed in Israel. It is basically seen as jihadist, a version of Hamas. So people fear, how do we prevent a new October 7th from happening? Israel is a deeply traumatized country after that, the massacres on that day, and want to prevent them. And
it sounds to me like Israel sees the world now through the lens of October 7th, not
yeah.
just its neighbors, also bigger forces. But I think we'll go into internal Israeli politics in a second. For now, what I hear from you is that these negotiations aren't about peace. It's about a new security architecture that could be quite different from the 1974 armistice, with guarantees from the US. So this, I think, is the main change that could change the asymmetry of the relationship, of the freedom of action of one side and not of the other. This is actually making me really listen of my political theory classes about Hobbesian worldview, that we all have the freedom of action. Actually, it's called the state of nature, and then we give away part of our sovereignty to a sovereign so we can have a social contract. This is a very interesting, I think a lot of people are writing about the new social contracts in our region, because every government now has to renew its social contract with the new world order that is taking place, and it's really interesting how different models are in different areas. For now, let's move one step further in the analysis and look at interests and leverages. Let's start at, for each side. So what are Syria's top interests in this file? So of course we can think of sovereignty. This is quite a simple interest to defend. I don't want another country invading my country. If you support Ukraine, you have to support Syria. It's a neighbor that's way stronger that is invading. So that's one narrative, ending strikes, legitimacy. But I also think there is a bit of reconstruction. We cannot have reconstruction in Syria while Israel keeps bombing randomly in different places. So I know that there are a lot of priorities, a lot of interests for Syria. But if you think about Syria's interests and red lines, how do you understand them?
So, from my sense about Damascus, and I've been studying, Jabhat al-Nusra and Hayat Tahrir al-Sham for many years. Their interests definitely have to do with sovereignty. They want to be able to control all the territories under Damascus's control, and they want to. This is something that is a matter of principle, and also showing that the country is strong. This is something that very much the state in Syria right now is almost non-existent. It's kind of it's deeply, deeply, deeply fragile state, and therefore there is this desire to project strength, and you see it in all sorts of ceremonies that are being held, and ministers who are traveling around in convoys of 11 fancy cars to show you we are a real state. So this is something that is both a matter of principle, but also a matter of projecting strength. And of course, they see Israeli actions as destabilizing. And I think, Israel's outreach particularly to the Kurds and the Druze, in kind of a very kind of blatant attempt to keep Damascus weak and to keep the country divided. Damascus believes that dealing with the Israeli file and reaching an agreement with Israel would help solve other issues. Now, the issue with the SDF was solved, through this blitz offensive after the SDF rejected the offer that Damascus made on January 4th of this year. But the issue of Suwayda remains stuck. So essentially, the view in Damascus is we don't that is my sense. We don't need to be reaching out to the Druze. We don't need to be apologizing for slaughtering them. We don't need to be apologizing for the decision of the very top leadership to send in forces to Sweden to solve a political dispute through military means. Um, we will just solve the problem with Israel, basically ensure that Israel stops providing support for al-Hijri and his militias, and this way, basically, they'll be forced kind of into submission as opposed to kind of reintegrating. Seeing this as reintegrating, about 400,000 Syrian citizens into the nation and building a nation that encompasses all people as partners, right? As opposed to subjugated subjects, who are, once they lose foreign support, are forced basically to kneel to Damascus. So that seems to be
State building by the sword, more or less.
what?
State building by the sword.
Yeah, exactly. So that is definitely an interest as well. Israeli airstrikes have basically stopped due to U.S. pressure, but of course they could renew. So this is something that definitely Damascus would like to stop. And I think there's a very clear kind of element here of projection to the outside. So the desire, basically, first of all, to show that the country is stable, to attract, foreign investment, foreign reconstruction money. This is necessary. And also, there is an element here, and this element is what drove the normalization of many regimes with Israel, is to improve their image internationally. So, particularly in the U.S. So basically, you achieve this deal, you show your willingness for peace, and this is why Syrian officials have spoken about being wanting to have peace with Israel, wanting to have good relations with Israel. This is a way to basically get people in the United States, particularly on the right, to look at this leadership as not a bunch of crazy jihadists who, have split off from ISIS and are basically ISIS and are, this kind of a typical right wing of looking at them, but like, oh, this is a pragmatic leadership that is willing to engage Israel, and basically it's a kind of image polishing exercise. So I think those are the kind of main interests that are driving Damascus. Of course, there's the issue of how it actually affects the livelihood of and lives of people in Quneitra. The Israeli occupation has been very destructive, restricting people's ability to reach their fields. Recently Israel began spraying pesticides, inside the newly occupied territories, to kind of clear brushes or whatever to areas from which theoretically, militants could attack Israel. So all of this is something that obviously the population is very angry about. And I also think that something that really matters to Damascus is public opinion, basically. Syrians are very, very angry about Israeli conduct. People have in the areas that are newly occupied have taken up arms. It happened in Koya, it happened in Beijing, as I mentioned. This is something that Damascus doesn't want things to slip out of control, and basically for the population there to start, I don't know, forming like local resistance brigades, and try to attack Israeli forces. And the population at large is just very furious. So people who are not affected by it are also furious. So this is something, and Damascus is being, seen as not acting forcefully enough against this threat. Now the problem is Damascus is very, very weak. It can't do much. So this is a matter that I think those are the elements that are kind of really driving the the Syrian kind of conduct here.
I mean, it's really fascinating. Thank you, because another thing that came to my mind while you're talking about legitimacy and views in the U.S. was actually the reintegration of Syrian Jews. Believe it or not, almost every single Jewish property in Syria is still there. And so it's not like in Germany after the Holocaust, where, okay, after people were displaced, you lost your property. In Syria, Jews can actually still go back and claim these places, and many Jews have actually returned to Aleppo and to Damascus. The synagogues are reopening. So this, I think, is also a message that is sent to the US, because the Syrian Jewish diaspora is quite big in the US. And I think this is also playing a role there. And we'll get to the international role, but now I also want to hear from your side, what are the Israeli interest, because I always hear security first, security first. I've also heard, what you've mentioned before. So they did state that they want a weak, divided, decentralized Syria. So I can't, honestly, a weak, destable Syria is actually not good for Israeli security. This would destabilize Israel over the long run. So how do you read actual, real Israeli interest in this kind of negotiation?
So I think I mean, you're absolutely right that destabilized Syria is. I believe it's not in the interest of Israel, but obviously I'm not an Israeli policymaker, and my views differ from theirs significantly. Um, in general, I think to understand Israeli foreign policy or defense policy, um, everything now goes back to October 7th. There's an immense trauma in the country and within the security establishment, which failed to prevent this catastrophe. And this is both on the level of military units on the ground, but also the intelligence assessment, because the information was out there that this attack and really its layout, even to the point of the number of hostages they intend to take, and basically underground locations and tunnels, etc., that they've prepared for holding these hostages. So because of that, Israel previously, a very central element of its national security policy relied on deterrence. That has kind of gone out the window. And now the idea is we thought that Hamas was deterred, and clearly we were wrong. We failed to estimate correctly the intentions of the enemy or adversary, and we also failed to some extent to identify the capabilities of the enemy. So therefore, there is a sense of lack of confidence inside the Israeli security establishment in their ability to assess what is going to happen in Syria. And actually, this, in the days really before the regime fell and after Assad, fled, Israeli officials told journalists, we didn't see this coming. We didn't see this coming, that the regime would fall. And therefore, Israel then invaded the south, destroyed the Syrian military, whatever serious capabilities it had. And this is despite the fact that, again, intelligence officials were saying, we have no evidence of a planned attack of any kind from the areas we're occupying by the Syrian military. It was just, okay, we failed to see this regime fall. We failed to see the October 7th attacks. Let's just err on the side of, extreme caution, basically, or in this case, kind of on the side of aggression, right? Of just acting very forcefully to prevent any threat. So that is one element. Another element that I think many people misunderstand about Israeli national security policy is that overall, there's really no strategy there. And this is something, for example, that Dr. Chuck Freilich, he was a part of the Israeli National Security Council in the past, has written about. He's written academic work on this, really kind of examining the factors that produce very weak kind of national security strategy building, especially kind of a strategy that is outside, because inside the IDF there is a planning directorate, but it is in charge of military planning, but really no such body, no such strategic planning exists on that combines both diplomacy and military, kind of a real national security strategy, the way it exists in other countries, And as a result, you see that Israeli policy is very reactive and is overly reliant on the use of military force, which is planned out, So we see, for example, the way the war on Hezbollah was carried out, right? There was very meticulous planning on the military side once there was a decision to go to war, and that decision was, by the way, taken due to a series of tactical developments on the ground. So I think it will be. I don't want to belabor the point because it's a podcast that is focused on Syria, but basically it was a series of tactical decisions that then led Israel to decide. Okay, Nasrallah was worried that his underground bunker was discovered and wanted to leave it, and Israel feared that it would lose track of him. So therefore decided to assassinate him. Therefore, it understood that there's going to be a full war. And they put a plan in motion that before Israel assassinates Nasrallah, it needs to destroy all the missiles that Hezbollah hid in civilian homes throughout the south and Dahia and Baalbek. And then once that is destroyed, then large caches that are buried underground in some locations, once that happens, then Israel goes and assassinates Nasrallah, and then there's a series of multiple strikes that basically there's a whole plan of how you carry out the war and achieve the military goal. Okay, so that war was arguably one of the most successful campaigns against a militant group as opposed to an army in terms of what it was able to achieve. And then an agreement is reached to end the war, but then there's no strategy. How Israel knows, for example, that Hezbollah cannot be fully disarmed through military means. So what is then the political strategy to facilitate this happening internally in Lebanon? So there's nothing there, Israel just stays in those 5 hills, contrary to the agreement, and just continues to bomb. So they're really, and we see the same with Syria, and we see the same with Iran. So in the case of Syria, okay, so Israel, reacted kind of after the regime fell, and there was this sense like, okay, Hamas is now like an Islamist force is now on the border again. We need to act. Okay, and what next? And the strategy. Okay, if we want to keep Syria divided and weak, that clearly is a strategy that already proved to be failing once the position of the Trump administration changed, and it lifted the sanctions, lifted the Caesar Act in opposition to Israel. Now also the SDF areas are gone, so this is something that should necessitate a recalibration of policy. I hope it happens, but overall, Israeli policy has been very reactive, and also, Kissinger is attributed to have said that Israel doesn't have foreign policy, only domestic policy, and this is very, very true in the case of Syria, particularly after the massacres of the Druze. That is when a political deal with Damascus became much more costly domestically in Israel. It was an utter disaster for Netanyahu because he appeared like a fool who was negotiating with this terrorist in a suit who tricked him. In reality, Israel entered the negotiations with Damascus because it was forced to do so by the Trump administration. But Netanyahu can't say this to the Israeli public, right? Oh, I've been forced to do this. I don't want to do this, right? So he spoke about great opportunities. Now that we've destroyed the Iranian axis, it's now time for peace and things of this nature. He spoke about it. The Israeli Minister of Foreign Affairs spoke about the opportunities with Syria. And then a massacre happens. And then everyone is like, this is a jihadist. This is ISIS, and there's a great deal of sympathy towards the Druze. The Druze in Israel they're definitely second-class citizens, but they're not seen as Muslim. They're not
It's in your previous podcast. We'll put
yeah,
a link to it in the
yeah,
description
exactly.
because you discuss this quite
Yeah,
deeply, and I think it's also quite important for people who study the region to understand the difference between Israeli Druze, Lebanese Druze, and
yeah,
Syrian Druze. Even though the majority are in Syria,
yeah,
the political weight is actually not there. There's a
yeah.
vacuum in that area, but this is a big area. But I'm glad that you've moved to national politics, to local politics, because this is where I want to focus a bit more. The government in Israel is a coalition. It's the most right-wing coalition it has in its history, as far as I've read.
It is, yeah.
How, it is. So do these coalitions constrain Israel's flexibility when it comes to negotiations with Syria? Or like which party or what kind of view can sell a withdrawal from the Golan or from the newly occupied territory to the Israeli public? Or is there no one who can do that?
So I'd say that the matter of Syria is, as opposed to, for example, Palestinian issue, is much more a decision that Netanyahu will make personally. So he's less constrained by his coalition partners. What he is constrained by is Israeli public opinion. He doesn't want this deal. For him, maintaining the status quo is fine. He doesn't see the long term possibly damaging consequences of this. He just wants to maintain the status quo, and it's the Americans who are pushing them into this deal. So he wants to obviously not appear disobedient or going against what President Trump wants, but at the same time he genuinely doesn't want this deal. He if it is forced upon him, he will pay the political price. He was forced to end the war on Gaza, and he did. And this was politically costly, much more politically costly than any deal with Syria. In Israel, there's really the Israelis in general are not particularly familiar with what's happening in Syria. Their general kind of outlook is that the new leadership is jihadist, and what they've heard about for the past year, since the regime fell, is not, for example, the celebrations of people in the streets and people being able, to speak their mind, and Syrian TV now having, oppositional voices come on it and speak forcefully. That is not something that received any attention in Israel, nor did, developments, for example, in the way HTS governed Idlib before the regime's fall. What they know about are the massacres of the Druze, which were front page news. Israeli media, because of the familial connection between Druze and Israel to Druze in Sweden, Israeli media would broadcast people speaking live as their neighbors are getting massacred, and are speaking the massacre is happening right next to them, and they're talking to Israeli media. So this something that left a huge impression on the minds of Israelis. So this is how this leadership is viewed, as jihadist and as massacres. The butchers of the Druze, basically, and other minorities. The massacres of the Alawis received attention, but just not as much. And there isn't this sympathy that exists with the Druze. So therefore, it is just politically costly to pass any deal that would mean that Israel is withdrawing from territories that it occupied. People in the occupied Golan who live there would feel less safe, would complain, what is this? This is unacceptable to us, and in general, the Israeli public just doesn't like the idea. So there's no real lobby for kind of a pullout from Syria and building a security relationship, for example, with Damascus, with the exception of maybe some voices inside the national security establishment who recognize the benefit of it. But those voices are utterly insignificant compared to the overall kind of attitude in Israel that is very hostile to these leaders. So, for example, on the 1 year anniversary of Assad's escape, there were these beautiful celebrations all over Syria, with millions of people out into the streets celebrating and crying and just rejoicing in the regime's fall. On the same day, the new Syrian regime held a military parade in Damascus, in several cities, but in Damascus, and they were chanting stuff about Gaza, this is the only thing that received coverage in Israel, not the celebrations. It was the parade, So this is obviously, very, this is something that very much serves the Israeli right wing and, voices that who are the majority in Israel basically are saying no deal should be reached with these people.
I mean, this is quite interesting because I always thought about the relationship, the asymmetry of the relationship between the two countries and how they're moving and how it's changing. And now what I hear, because I want to move from the national to the regional lens, more or less, if there is no deal with Syria, why would Israel think that it can reach a deal with Saudi Arabia? As an analyst, I don't understand it. I thought at some point that there was some kind of package.
Mm-hmm.
So listen, be nice to the Syrians. They won't attack you. There will be guarantees by the US in exchange for some kind of business deal for the reconstruction of Gaza, reconstruction of Syria, with capital from Saudi Arabia. That was quite a plausible opportunity. Many Syrians were discussing the pros and cons of it in the policy circles. But then when the approach was clear that, this borderline spoiling, like, listen, we only will do this if we have to, then I really wonder how would this reflect regionally? Because in your previous podcast, you do discuss Turkey, the relationship with Turkey. Now, today, as we're speaking, there's all of this military buildup near Iran. So everyone is talking about Iran, and I really wonder if Syria would take some kind of advantage if Israel is busy with Iran. Maybe something in Sweden can happen at that point. So I really wonder, from the regional perspective to you, how does Turkey and Saudi Arabia sit in the picture? And after that, I want to look at the Europeans, because to me, the Europeans are just our regional neighbors. I live in the Netherlands, in Maastricht right now, and they always look at Syria and Israel through the same lens. They call it the southern neighborhoods. Mm-hmm. So as our northern neighbors and our southern neighbors, what's the regional view about these negotiations? Who's trying to push for more floors and more ceilings, from your understanding?
So from my understanding, basically all regional powers who are sometimes grouped into different axes are supportive of this deal. So both Turkey, for example, wants this deal, and as does Saudi Arabia, because it clearly serves the interests of the Syrian government. And the U.S. is pushing for it as well. Obviously, the only forces that are kind of very clearly against it are, the Iranian axis and the Israelis, particularly kind of the mainstream. Like I can't even call it right wing. Kind of the mainstream Israeli approach of let's just keep things as they are. This is preferable to us. This keeps us safer. So. I think that deeper actual normalization, that is something that I suspect that Turkey, that Qatar would oppose. Qatari media is very kind of strongly against it, but a more limited security deal is something that clearly benefits Damascus and therefore enjoys wide support. With regards to the ability to tie things together with Saudi Arabia, Saudi played an important role kind of in initial mediation, between it was conveying messages, and then more than that, between the new Syrian government and Israel, to signal Damascus's desire to have normal relations with Israel, to assuage Israeli fears about the jihadist background of the rulers of Syria. Saudi Arabia basically was the one to hand over. Basically, Syrian President Assad flew to Riyadh, I believe, handed over the documents of Eli Cohen, the Israeli spy who was executed in Damascus in 1965. So his documents, things that like the Mukhabarat file that was held against him, some personal items, were flown to Saudi and from there to Israel, and handed over, to Israeli authorities and to Eli Cohen's widow. So this was done as a gesture of goodwill, and Saudi played an important role in it. Also, Saudi media played a role in kind of providing exclusive information that, I've confirmed it was correct, and they were the first to report it, because obviously they know, because they're the ones being involved in this. And also in kind of trying to promote this. But since then, I think particularly kind of Israeli obstinance with regards to the day after in Gaza, the Board of Peace, kind of its refusal to countenance or accept any kind of significant role for the Palestinian Authority, even if it undergoes reform in the management of Gaza, is something that soured relations with Saudi Arabia, and then also just the spat that happened between Saudi Arabia and the UAE. So the fact that the UAE normalized with Israel is being used by Saudi to tarnish kind of the Emirati reputation, even though Saudi itself was very close to reaching a normalization deal with Israel prior to October 7th. And of course, the war in Gaza, and um, and the horrors that that Israel inflicted on Gazans is something that is resonant in Saudi public opinion. So it just makes normalization less of a priority for Riyadh, and therefore I think that um, the prospects for normalization, especially under the current government and current prime minister, appear to me slimmer than we would think maybe 6 months ago, before all these developments, before the war in Gaza ended, and kind of the Israeli approach towards Gaza and towards the Palestinian Authority became kind of more crystal clear, that Israel, in a sense, prefers a weakened Hamas governing Gaza over the Palestinian Authority, and this is something that obviously is not in line with the Saudi position at all.
I think the relationship between the Israeli authorities and Hamas is something that many have written about, and I would really recommend our listeners to go and check it out, because it is a rabbit hole in itself. But I completely agree with you, because in Saudi Arabia, in Turkey as well, you've mentioned it in a previous podcast, in Syria, all around the Arab and Muslim world, and even now in Europe, Gaza is a central lens in which Israel is viewed. Yeah. And I think this is something that may be not so clear to the Israeli public. I mean, you do hear it when Israelis are traveling, yeah, but I don't think the public is aware that the world now views you through the lens of October 7, which is quite difficult to a certain extent when it's such a traumatic event. I'm not saying it's the correct or incorrect thing to do.
I think that Israelis, recognize this to a large extent. It's just that they don't care. To them, this is an existential threat. Now, before October 7th, there was a small majority of Israelis who supported a two-state solution. Now it's down to about 20%. Israelis are willing to live in an isolated and hated country, as if it means ensuring their survival. So they previously, there was an argument that the left would make, like, we want good, relations with the world. We don't want to get boycotted. We don't want. This is now completely irrelevant. People are willing to live under sanctions, even if it means that Israel will continue to press a boot on the heads of Palestinians, because that's the only way to prevent another mass slaughter. So, yeah, this is unfortunately the reality now, and people who are not willing to live in such an isolated and pariah state are leaving. Tens of thousands of leftists have immigrated the country. I came back to Israel after 3 years. I was doing field work in Iraq and then got kidnapped. Half of my friends are gone. My milieu is kind of human rights activists. Half of them are gone. I've scattered all around. And the population that remains in Israel is very determined to not let something like October 7th happen again. And that means, be pursuing an extremely aggressive policy everywhere, particularly when it comes to the Palestinians, but also Syria.
Yeah. I mean, this is really fascinating about perceptions because one event can change the perception of an entire nation for quite some time. I think 9/11 is the event that
Yeah.
we often think about and how it changed the US's view of the world. And how long did it take for Americans to just say, okay, this may or may not have been the best or worst choice. So it's really like, when people think of October 7, you cannot take away the 9/11 comparison one to one, because after 9/11 you have Iraq.
Yeah, yeah. In
And
Afghanistan, yeah.
with Israeli applause,
Yeah.
with Israeli applause. So I think it is quite a fascinating thing. But now let's move a tiny bit beyond diplomacy. I want to ask, what are Washington's real tools? So I know that we skipped the EU, but this question now will also apply to the EU. So what are the real tools to pressure Israel and Syria? So we have sanctions. Most of them are removed. We still don't have bank access in Syria, by the way. So I was in Syria last month. I went to a bank and I tried to say, hey, the sanctions are removed. Why can't I send the hawala to my family? And they told me, in short, the banks in Europe still refuse to trade with the banks in Syria. The banks in the US still refuse to trade. So what are the tools, what are the policy tools that policymakers in Washington and in the EU have in relation to move this kind of stalemates one way or another?
I think you kind of skipped the EU because I mean, I don't think it's an accident. They're irrelevant.
Your words, not mine. I work for the EU, so these are your words. But thank you for saying them.
It's very the recording resumed because I got a call on WhatsApp and it interrupted the recording, at least on my end. Yeah. Hopefully he won't call again. Although this guy it tends to be insistent. But yeah. So yeah. So I would say that the EU is. I mean, the EU could do a lot. It's just never willing to do anything. So it's kind of pointless to discuss it. I think that with regards to the US, it has immense power and it has used it. The only reason Israel is negotiating with the Syrians is, because of US pressure. And while people inside the the national security system have uh, some of them have come to understand even after after the regime fell, after Assad fled, there was this consistent outreach from Damascus through various channels, through the UAE, through Saudi, through just public statements that they want a different kind of relationship with Israel. They wanted good relations. So some came to be convinced by it and saw it also as a useful way to kind of the security cooperation with the new authorities would be a great way to, to prevent smuggling of weapons to Lebanese Hezbollah and to proxies inside Syria that Iran is trying to activate. But still, the reason that really kind of elevated the talks and made them much more serious is kind of the change in the position of the U.S. government. Basically, the meeting that happened between Ashara and Trump in Riyadh, and the removal of Caesar, despite Israeli insistence and personal pleas from Netanyahu that the sanctions remain in place. So and just pressure to engage in talks, because Trump wants his legacy. He wants it to be achieving peace, and expanding the Abraham Accords. So the U.S. really, I believe if it remains engaged on this issue on a very high level, and it seems that Israel has sometimes a tendency to ignore what Barak is telling it, and only when more like individuals who either the president himself gets involved or Kushner or Witkoff, then Israel kind of pays more attention. So I think that just sustained engagement on the part of the top U.S. leadership is something that can really produce an agreement in quite a short period of time. Especially if it's just focused on security and doesn't include and basically guarantees the Israeli withdrawal. as opposed to something broader that obviously, something relating to trade. In this regard, it is useful to point out that, Syria concluded gas deals with both Jordan and Egypt, which are exporters of gas and which are importers of gas, and they are exporting the gas from Israel. So essentially, there is already economic cooperation that is happening. It's just that the Syrian leadership and the Israeli are not honest to their public about what is happening here, right? Because this is essentially a kind of a first link of economic cooperation that is not being declared. Uh, and I think because in both countries it would be politically costly for the leaders to talk about it.
Yeah, it's easier to say, hey, we sold some gas and hey, we bought some gas without going into details about where it actually came from. And if you think about it, there is something we've been talking about before the podcast. I really think the Europeans have something to add here because they have a functioning example of economic integration and then, these different kind of policy area integrations that can reduce the likelihood of clashing, so creating more interdependencies. This is, the liberal model that has shown to work in certain areas, or at least in regions that are quite war-torn. But I wanted to, now we're moving to the end of the podcast. Thank you very much for giving us all of this time. I have two more questions. One of them was about, potential spoilers of looking at it. But from this conversation, I hear that there are a lot of spoilers. So it would be quite difficult to pinpoint each and every one. But I think instead, can you give our listeners three, or some signals that you're watching that can tell you, okay, maybe the talks, the negotiations, the relationship is moving in a more healthier direction, or they're just going into the stalemate, the status quo that, Israel is currently comfortable with?
Yeah, I mean, I would just point to the spoilers. This is an issue that you raised, that maybe Syria will use kind of Israel being distracted by Iran to, do something this without, which would mean a military invasion and clashes with the militias there, and also just Druze would take up arms. Israel is definitely not going to allow that. That would be obviously a huge spoiler, but it would also mean mass death of Syrian soldiers. So I hope that Damascus understands this. Israel will its commitment to the safety of the Druze in Syria is total, and this is a very different situation from the situation of the Kurds in the northeast, with whom there's no Kurdish constituency inside Israel. There are Kurdish Jews, but they have no familial connections anymore to Syria. There's no Kurdish lobby. It's just not a thing. Whereas the Druze are in very key positions throughout the military, in very high-ranking positions. They're overrepresented inside the military and also inside politics. So therefore, it's a very, very different situation. With regards to what I am watching, I think, we are waiting to see if this fusion cell gets established. This is something that, it seems that both sides, both the Syrian and the Israeli, have been kind of dragging their feet about it, while the U.S. is eager to set this thing in place. Also, how frequent are the talks that are taking place, basically. Dermer, who used to manage the talks until the end of last year, he quit and was replaced basically by three individuals who are now running the talks. So one is from the Israeli National Security Council, the next is the Israeli ambassador to Washington, and another is the military secretary of the prime minister, who is set to be the next head of Mossad. They're all smart individuals, and I would say that could do, if they're given the order to from Netanyahu to reach a deal, they could do so very easily. They're competent. They're, Netanyahu, appoints ministers who are largely incompetent and are really clowns. His entire Likud party is full of these utter rabid loyalists who are kind of low IQ individuals. But to key positions, he actually appoints very, very smart people. So all of these individuals are very smart, very competent, could get the job done. But just like Dermer, he was his trusted guy in running so many files because he was like the one intelligent guy in the group pretty much. And so he relied on him very heavily. So now these guys have taken on this role. It would be very important to watch when the next talks are held. Like no talks have happened in a while, so the tempo needs to step up for progress to be made, and also the identity of the U.S. delegation, basically. The last talks in Paris, Trump, first of all, called Netanyahu before the talks and told him, I want to see progress. And also, he sent to the meeting Kushner and Witkoff, which was very important to signal that the president, that this is, you can't just ignore what Barack is saying to you, like you did before. This is something that comes straight from the top. These are the closest people to Trump. And indeed, progress was made, right? So I think this is something that is very important to watch. Basically, when is the fusion cell set up? When are the next talks going to happen, and the frequency of subsequent talks, and the level of engagement on the U.S. side. If we hear also about reports about calls between President Trump and Netanyahu with regards to Syria, that is also something that would be very helpful and can really just speed things along. And basically force Netanyahu into this deal that he does not want to do. If there's no use engagement, there's just not going to be a deal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, of course, when you have an asymmetric negotiation, unless you pressure one of the sides, you're just going to get a status quo of the same asymmetry. So I think with this, Elizabeth, I will go to our last question, which is always about policy recommendations. And since you've mentioned that the EU is quite irrelevant, and I think this is a podcast, I have a lot of European policymakers who follow. I have some American policymakers, but it's mostly the Europeans that we're trying to educate about the area, because I've worked for the EU, I've worked for the Parliament, and I've seen, I'm not saying people who understand the region quite well. Now there's a new generation of young civil servants who actually understand the region, but unfortunately the previous generation are all people who, let's say, have drank the Kool-Aid and have no idea what they're doing. So there's a reason why the EU is actually not an actor on Israel, Syria, Palestine, even though they're the biggest donors in the world. Like when we look at the EU and its member states, they have money to be talked about. And I think this is more or less the sad situation of policymakers. So if there are some European and Arab, international, any policymaker who's listening to this podcast, what would you advise them to look at when it comes to how can they support these negotiations, or how can they have actual influence in this very difficult situation, especially that Syria was kind of a lost case for the EU. Now there's a chance. So how can they take that chance?
So I think the EU can do a whole lot when it comes to Syria internally to to promote programs that make sure that Syria progresses in a direction that is in line with EU values. That could be all sorts of projects to, solve disputes between communities, particularly, minorities, the Druze community, the Sunnis and Alawis, working to, advance and build skills of Syrian public servants, of Syrian women. So all of these are things that are in line with EU values. It's just, I said that the EU is useless when it comes to Israel and Syria, because it would require using EU leverage, which is real leverage. The EU, its countries are the main trade partners of Israel. In theory, a lot can be done, but if they didn't do that for Gaza, to stop, this endless, extremely, extremely costly, bloody war, why would they do it for to just advance negotiations. So they could, in theory, do something, but they just won't. So therefore, I am very, very happy to hear that that there's this new generation of EU policymakers who are actually familiar with the region. My experience in engaging with EU diplomats obviously stopped in 2023 when I got kidnapped. My impression until that point was not particularly positive, but this is actually not. This applies to diplomats overall. I mean, it just in the U.S. as well. There were some exceptions, wonderful exceptions, but overall, it just there's a huge disconnect in the way people are taught about the region. I took courses and taught also at Princeton as a PhD student. People who then end up in the foreign service or in other national security positions, and it's so foreign to people. Most have never traveled abroad, don't speak any foreign languages. I mean, it's this is a systematic problem, and I'm very happy to hear that this is something that is changing, at least on the EU side, so I think definitely engagement with Syria. Syria is in desperate need for anything, for any help that can just make lives of people more livable. And so many of these projects can be done in a way that also helps broader EU goals. So instead of just, I don't know, setting up a farm, to help people, or giving people tools to work in agriculture so that they can, sustain themselves and reduce the pressure on NGOs that are providing livelihood assistance, or just food baskets or whatever. So this can be done in a way that engages communities, cross-confessionally, in a way to also rebuild trust that has been, very, very damaged throughout the civil war, and also the year after it, and the massacres that occurred, and kind of this rise of Sunni Arab chauvinism. So there are many, many, many things that the EU and other countries could do, and other partners could do. I think that on the kind of advancing the talks between Syria and Israel, this is not something that they're going to use their leverage on.
Yeah, I mean, unfortunately, what I'm hearing currently in the EU is that most of the talks are taken from the lens of returns, refugee returns. So it's not productive at the moment. Yeah. The question is, when will the Europeans feel the pinch about the economy and realize that you need to change your model? But this is a discussion for another day. Elizabeth Tsurkov, thank you for joining us. As a reminder, the views and opinions expressed in this episode are those of the guest and do not necessarily reflect the position of the Syria Spectrum, the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy, or the Change for Syria network. A sincere thank you to our outstanding production and research team for their continued dedication. The Syria Spectrum podcast is produced with the support of the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy and in partnership with the Change for Syria network. I'm Zakaria Al Shmaly, and this is the Syria Spectrum, bringing you policy through perspectives.